For many of us, when we think of fairy art, the delightful, pretty, flower-filled kind, we think of one artist first and foremost, the wonderful Cicely Mary Barker, creator of the beautiful images of fairy children complemented by whimsical poetry that we treasure as the flower fairies. Surely all of us will know at least one of her works, and their place in popular culture is still so visible to this very day. And what a blessing that is for all of us who love fairy art. So who was Cicely, and what led to her to becoming one of the most famous of the fairy artists? She was born on the 28th of June 1895 at 66 Whaddon Road in Croydon, in England, the second and youngest daughter of Mary Eleanor and Walter Barker. This was a devout Anglican household. As a child she was diagnosed with epilepsy, and both her parents cared for her in her early years, and in later years she was cared for by her sister Dorothy. The Barker family were one of the growing middle classes of this era, well off enough to be able to afford a nanny, a governess, or even a cook who could make special food to help with Cicely's dietary health. As a child, she spent a lot of her time bedridden, reading and painting, inspired by her favourite artists of the pre-Raphaelite era, and also the artist Kate Greenaway. As she grew older, she began to take correspondence courses in art. It's thought up to around 1919. At only 13 years old, she joined an evening class at Croydon School of Art and stayed on there until well into the 1940s, eventually even becoming one of their own art teachers. Despite her education, she was known, however, to paint instinctively and actively turned her back on received art theory. 1911 proved to be an interesting year for Cicely. She was successful in selling 4 of her drawings to Raphael Tuck & Sons, prolific postcard printers of the time, with a national sales base. She was paid half a sovereign, and these 4 images became part of Tuck & Sons' catalogue. In October, she came second in an art competition at Croydon Art Society with her poster design, and not too long afterwards was made the youngest official member. The art critic of the Croydon Advertiser, the area's local newspaper, praised Cicely, saying, "Her drawings show a remarkable freedom of spirit. She has distinct promise." In June 1912, Walter Barker, father of the household, sadly passed away. Cicely was only 17 years old. No doubt still grieving and desperate to help the household finances, she submitted both art and poetry to the magazines the Raphael Tuck Annual, Leading Strings, Child's Own and My Magazine. Her beloved sister Dorothy became a teacher of kindergarten at 2 private schools and eventually would open a kindergarten in their own home. Both daughters brought money in to keep the family ticking along. During this time, fairies had become very popular subjects of literature and art. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, writer of the Sherlock Holmes novels and fascinated by all things paranormal and supernatural and fairies, had published a book, The Coming of the Fairies. Also, J.M. Barrie had published Peter Pan. Ida Rentoul Outhwaite had also been busy with fairy-themed work. Queen Mary added to the fairy love by sending Outhwaite postcards to friends and family. So Cicely decided to explore this inspiration and in 1918 brought out a collection of art cards with fairies and elves. Cicely now sent her fairy paintings out to various publishers seeking work. In 1923, the publishers Blackie bought 24 images with accompanying poetry. For this, she was paid the princely sum of £25 sterling. Royalties would not start to be sent to her, though, until 1925, when The Flower Fairies of the Summer was brought out. Now she started to make regular money. The Flower Fairies and Cicely became established in published art, society and illustration. In 1924, with things looking a little more stable financially, the family moved to a new home, 23 The Waldrons in Croydon, a 4-storey semi-detached Victorian house. Cicely had her own studio in the garden, and her sister's kindergarten was in a room at the rear of their home. As working-class ladies, the family attended 2 very different churches on Sundays, and these churches were kept for the less moneyed in society. Although things were better for the Barkers, they still had to be very careful and frugal with their money. Cicely, when painting more religious subjects, would often use members of the congregations of St Andrew's and St Edmund's. Of course, having a kindergarten in the home was a blessing for Cicely. She had a ready supply of young models for her flower fairies, and she had them model for her until the kindergarten closed in 1940. She also used the young child relatives of their housekeeper Gladys Tidy, who also modelled for the Primrose Fairy herself in 1923. Throughout her life, Cicely, while active as an artist, would carry sketchbooks with her at all times to capture the likenesses of any interesting children she came across. She was a prolific artist of children, and not just fairy ones. Her paintings were used for many publications, and she also became a writer of children's stories, which naturally she illustrated herself. All of the plants that Cicely painted, accompanying her fairies, were direct studies, and if she was missing a subject, the kind staff at Kew Gardens helped with sourcing the flowers and the leaves she needed. The costumes she also created herself, inspired by the flowers of the plants that she was painting. These costumes were stored in a huge trunk in the studio, with wings made of twigs and gauze as well. Once the illustration had been finished, Cicely would take apart the costumes to recycle them into the next costumes needed for the next paintings. Later in the 1920s, Cicely, who was always a devout Christian, began to feel that she needed to move away from her fairy themes and focus solely on Christianity-inspired works. Her faith had always been so important to her. During this time, she designed works for many churches and chapels and charitable institutions. She still continued attending art classes between 1920 and 1940 at Croydon Art School, and eventually she became a teacher. Spreading her wings a little, she began to travel also, to Amberley and Storrington in Sussex, also to the southwest to Cornwall. She went to stay with one of her art contemporaries and friends, Margaret Tarrant, in Gomshall in Surrey for a while, and also stayed with family in North Yorkshire, near Whitby, at Ugglebarnby. 1940 saw changes at home. Their housekeeper retired and Dorothy's kindergarten finally closed. She took on the role of caring for both her mother and Cicely's needs in the house. The 2 sisters collaborated on 2 books after this time, Our Darling's first book and the religious tome He Leadeth Me. Tragedy struck in 1954. Beloved Dorothy passed away suddenly of a heart attack. Now Cicely was her mother's sole carer, and art was put aside. One project she did dedicate herself to, though, was the design of a stained glass window for St Edmund's Church in Pitlake that would be dedicated to Dorothy. In 1960, Cicely's mother passed away, and Cicely was left alone. Understandably, she decided to move home the year after to find a new start, to 6 Dupas Avenue in Croydon. She was left a house by her friend Edith Major on Edith's death, and she decided to restore and update this maisonette. Once it was finished, she named it St Andrew's, and she moved in. Her home was now based in Storrington in Sussex, a place of many happy memories. Sadly, though, her health began to suffer once she had moved, and she was constantly in and out of convalescent homes and being cared for by relatives and close friends. On the 16th of February 1973, our Cicely Mary Barker our lovely flower fairy artist left this world. She was 77 years old. There were 2 funeral services for her, one at Storrington and one at her own home. Cicely's ashes were then scattered at the church in Storrington. In 1989, Frederick Warne, a division of Penguin Books, bought the rights to all the flower fairy images and poems. Her religious works had already been donated to Christian and military fundraisers, and Queen Mary had even bought one of her religious paintings. Cicely never painted works for a Winter Flower Fairy edition, but there were enough paintings that in 1985 a book was released of the Winter Flower Fairies. Finally the seasons were complete, and what a blessing that is for all of us.